Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar where the topic is on the prevention of injuries, claims, and prosecution from the hazards of vibrating tools. I hope you all can hear me. If not, just let me know in the message box whether there are any transmission problems. Just a bit of background about myself. I'm Satish Lakiani. I am a consultant, independent consultant of SL Acoustics, and I have been an independent consultant for the last 4 years. And prior to being an independent consultant, I was employed in industry over a period spanning 20 years, where I first started as an acoustic engineer involved in the design and development of hearing protection for the military, and then went on to become an acoustic consultant with a large consultancy firm. Just a bit of housekeeping as far as tonight is concerned. If you have any questions as we go along, you can put your questions in the questions box, or you can hold fire till the end, because we've got a dedicated question and answer session where you can fire away then. So we'll leave it to you as to how you want to put the questions if you do have any questions arising. Let's see what we got in store for us today. We'll start off with the content is as follows. First of all, we'll start off with hand-arm vibration syndrome. What is it? I'll explain that to you, and the signs and symptoms of the injury. Next, I'll explain to you. Well, the next topic is the lack of HAVS awareness an issue, and perhaps I'll show you maybe that may be an issue, and how I'll explain to you as well how you would go about determining the risks of HAVS in your workplace. Then, what is the applicable legislation as far as hand-arm vibration is concerned? And once you've determined the risks of HAVS in your workplace, how would you go about assessing the risks in a competent manner? And once you have assessed the risks, what examples of controls could you implement to comply with the regulations and also prevent injury? And finally, I will explain to you what systems and processes you should look to put in place so that it'll enable you to defend against civil claims successfully, and perhaps discourage baseless ones, and also prevent HSE intervention. So let's start off with hand-arm vibration syndrome. What is hand-arm vibration syndrome? It's actually a collective term that's given for an injury to the hand and arm arising from contact vibrational equipment. It's generally made up of 3 components, where the first component is often known as finger blanching. We've seen this before, and it may also be known as vibration white finger. Now, this arises from the vibrations damaging the blood vessels, where the symptoms start off as finger blanching at the fingertips. And then as the injury progresses and it gets worse, the blanching travels down the fingers towards the palm of the hand. The second component of injury leads to a loss of feeling and dexterity. And it actually arises from the vibration damaging the nerves to the hand and fingers, It starts off as tingly fingers, but then as the injury gets worse, it leads to total loss of feeling and dexterity if it's not managed properly. Then in third place, you have what's known as musculoskeletal damage, where the vibration damages the muscles between the lower arm and the wrist, and it results in the weakness of grip strength and also pain in the wrist and hands. This quite often, this injury is associated with carpal tunnel syndrome. You must be aware that certainly the first 2 components of injury, finger blanching and loss of feeling, beyond a certain stage, these injuries can become irreversible. So effectively, prevention is the only form of cure. And here are the words, or here's how a sufferer of HAVs relates to how his life has been changed. If you read that, you can see that it's just like he has issues just doing everyday things, and no doubt it's not just his life that has changed, but I'm sure it probably affects his family as well. So you can read from that it's certainly not a nice injury to have. I took a poll across a couple of social media platforms, and I asked the question, why HAVs is still an issue in the workplace, even though legislation has been around for 16 years. And in first place, across both these social media platforms, the response was the lack of awareness of HAVs. And just for your information, in second and third place, which were reflected across both these social media platforms, in second place, there were either no controls that were implemented, or if they were implemented, they were ineffective. And in third place, it was the lack of risk assessments, or if risk assessments were carried out, they were not to a sufficient standard. And here's a couple of quotes from one of them from a supervisor who looks after a tradesperson using power tools in the workplace. And here's one also from a builder who I know quite well, who uses power tools or used to use power tools when he was working as a builder. He's no longer working as a builder. So from this slide and the previous slide, is the lack of HAVs awareness a big problem? I'll leave you to decide. And here's some evidence to show that it does exist in the workplace. I've got this infographic here, which was provided by the HSE, where it was reported that between 2014 and 2018, the ill health RIDDORs that were reported, it was nearly 50% of them were associated with HAVs. And in the construction industry, between 2018 and 2019, there was nearly an increase by a third in hand-arm vibration breaches across construction sites. And the Office of Rail and Road, I'm sorry if this image is not very clear, the Office of Rail and Road reported that between 2017/2018 and 2018/2019, there was nearly a 58% increase in cases of HAVs. So as you can see, HAVs is well and truly kicking out there in industry. I got this off the HSE website not so long ago. And apparently it seems from what the HSE report that hand-arm vibration syndrome, they regard that to be an underestimated and perhaps an underreported problem. One of the reasons why they reckon this is the case, because there seems to be a lack of knowledge regarding the availability of compensation. And many of you have no doubt seen these prosecutions over the last few years. And these prosecutions actually happened after 2016, where the manner of sentencing had changed drastically. In fact, it became a bit more draconian. And that's probably the reason why many of these fines here venture well into six-figure territory. Which are the industries of risk? Well, here are some. The list is by no means exhaustive. Many of you tuning in tonight will probably be able to pigeonhole yourself in one or other of these industries. And what about tools? What about tools as far as hand-arm vibration is concerned? Well, if you're using these sort of tools in your work area with these sort of operational times, then there is a risk that halves may be an issue in your organization. So it would justify you carrying out a risk assessment. There are other risks that you should look out for as far as hand-arm vibration is concerned. One of them is if your employees show signs of tingly fingers, or they complain of tingly fingers 15 to 20 minutes after using power tools, that should be looked on as a risk. In fact, if the answer is yes to this, the HSE would regard this as a matter of evident concern. And if you've only got any tools which you consider to be used for significantly long periods of time, that also should be looked on as a risk, because I'll explain to you later, the risk not only depends on the vibration level of the tool, but how long the tool is used for. Now, there may be other conditions that make employees vulnerable to HAVS injuries. And one of these conditions is when they work in cold and damp environments, because in such environments, the blood circulation slows down. And when the blood circulation slows down, it does make them more vulnerable to HAVS. So look out for employees where they work in this sort of environment. And typically it could apply to utility workers, ground staff, and construction site workers as well. And if your employees are adopting awkward postures when using tools, again, that's a risk, because this may give rise to musculoskeletal type of injuries, where it results in as I explained to you earlier, it results in weak grips, poor strength, weak strength. And as a result of this, it may also be a safety issue, because somebody operating a tool with weak grip, it's definitely a safety-related issue. It might not. It may always. It could be a safety-related issue, not just to him, but also his employees who may be working in the close proximity to him. So what's the relevant legislation as far as hand-arm vibration is concerned? Well, we've got the Control of Vibration at Work regulations, which it came into effect about 16 years ago, where it was introduced for the purpose of preventing injuries or hand-arm vibration injuries to employees. It imposed certain duties on employers. Now, in there, amongst other things, there are a couple of trigger levels, where when you assess your risks, you have to see where your risks lie as far as those trigger levels are concerned. And depending on where your risks lie, you will have to implement controls accordingly. But I'll explain all that to you in the next few slides. And in the vibration regulation, in the regulations, it explains how you should go about carrying out a risk assessment. And I'll put the stages out here as to how you go about doing that. First of all, you should look to identify those who may be at a risk from hand-arm vibration. And a few slides ago, I explained to you how you'd go about doing that. Then the next stage is to actually assess the risk. In other words, you have to quantify the risk, which I'll explain to you in a bit more detail after a few slides. And then once you've quantified the risk, you have to compare it against those limits in the regulations, which were those two trigger values I was telling you about. Then your next stage is to implement controls to reduce the risks to as low as reasonably practicable. And you need to identify those employees who may be particularly at risk. These could be employees who've already got the signs of HAVS, or who may be particularly sensitive to vibration. And indeed, there may be employees who are actually working in cold and damp environments. So you have to identify the employees or the groups of employees so that you can manage them specially. And later on down the line, if things do change in your organization, where work schedules change, work patterns change, and you have new employees joining, an increased workforce, and you deem the risks to have increased, then that's the reason. That'll give you good reason why you should reassess the risks. I've put this last line here because this is something I've experienced in the past, where I've gone to the extent of carrying out a risk assessment for a few businesses, only to find out later, rather frustratingly, that the risk assessment has been put in a drawer, never to see the light of day. So my strong recommendation to you is that as soon as you carry out your risk assessment, you must go ahead and implement the controls, and also you're required to share the outcome of the risk assessment with your employees. How do we go about quantifying the risk? Well, it's defined in the vibration regulations, which it is the quantity daily vibration exposure, assigned the symbols A8. And the daily vibration exposure is made up of the tool vibration level and the exposure time. So these are the two quantities you need to find out so you can assess the daily vibration exposure of the employee when using the power tool. Now let's start off with the vibration level of the tool. How would you go about obtaining that? There's various ways by which you can do so. One of them is you go online. The HSC have got a database available online which gives tool vibration magnitudes. It's indicative. Well, it's a table of indicative tool vibration magnitudes. It's good enough to use for an initial risk assessment. But if you actually want to tie down the vibration level of the tool, your tool to a particular model number and the manufacturer, then there are other databases available online where you can get this information. It's a good idea to get this information from at least a couple of independent databases. And if the vibration levels do tie up, then it gives you good confidence that you can use that figure for your risk assessment. There's other ways by which you could determine your tool vibration levels. And one of the ways is by measurement. This is the advantage, that it is a measurement of your tool in your workplace by your employees, your processes. So it's very specific to your work environment. However, whoever is carrying out the measurement must be familiar or must be competent enough to carry out the measurement and be familiar with that ISO standard, ISO 5349-2. This is referred to in the vibration regulations. And in this standard, it explains, or rather gives guidance on the strategy to adopt when measuring vibrations from different types of vibrating tools. And also, just as important, it gives guidance on how to attach the sensor to the vibrating tool, because if the sensor is attached incorrectly, you could get invalid data and it will end up invalidating your risk assessment. And the measuring equipment to carry out these vibration measurements must conform to this ISO standard 8041, which is also called up in the vibration regulations. Now, I've made this statement here because in the past, there was an organization that contacted me asking me to sanitize their vibration results. The vibration results didn't seem to make much sense, and it turned out that they carried out their measurements and they were using equipment that did not conform to ISO 8041. So I thought I'd put this in here just to make you aware of that. Now, whoever is carrying out the assessments doesn't really have to be familiar with the bells and whistles and the guts of this ISO 8041, but just to be reassured that the measuring equipment they're using to carry out the measurements must conform to this ISO standard. Now, here's a myth buster. There are equipment suppliers out there who provide equipment where the sensor to measure the vibration is either mounted on the wrist of the operative or in a glove that the operative wears when he's using the power tool. These kind of measurement systems, the HSC has prompted the HSE to put out a document online where I'll just push out a few extracts from that. They reckon that these measurement methods are not likely to be reliable, and that the actual hand down vibration measurements must be made with the sensors attached to the vibrating surface, i.e. the tool handles, for example, and that they say that such measurement methods, i.e. the glove and wrist mounted measurement methods, are not suitable for risk assessment purposes, rather to refer to that ISO standard I was telling you about. So it's quite clear where the HSE stand on this, and that is so the fact that you can use such measurement methods for risk assessments, that myth has been busted. You have to be careful about using manufacturer's data for vibration levels. I thought I'd point that out to you, because the manufacturer's vibration levels are vibration levels that are conducted in a lab environment. Now, the manufacturers are legally required to declare such vibration levels. However, they're conducted in a lab environment in accordance with international standards. So it's a very sterile environment because it's also conducted on new tools and new consumables. Whereas in the field, the conditions are going to be very different. And in the field, they're probably going to be more harsher, because you've got aged tools, worn consumables, and different operators using the tools. So it's going to be a lot harsher. And if you are going to use manufacturer's data for your risk assessment, you may run the risk of underestimating the risks of exposure. Your best bet would be, if you have no other choice, just check with the manufacturers first to see if their data is valid for use in a risk assessment. But quite often of the time, my experience has shown that it's not valid to use manufacturers' data. Rather, look to get your data from elsewhere. The manufacturer's data does come in useful if you're looking to make an informed decision to purchase or select the tool. So up to now, let's say we've got the vibration level of the tool. The next thing to do is to determine the exposure time. How would you do that? You could ask the operative, but be very careful, because sometimes the operative may give you the time taken to actually complete the task. But that's not what you're after. You're after the trigger time. So make that clear to the operative. You could time the process or use a decent tool timer. Or depending upon your organization, if you're one, say, for example, that you manufacture components, and your components require some degree of finishing or some form of finishing, you can time how long it takes the operative to finish the tool, or to work on the tool, to work on the component using the tool, and then look at the end of the day, look at the batch that he has worked on, see how many are in there, and from that you can assess the exposure time of the operative using that particular power tool. So now that you've got all the information, the vibration level of the tool and the exposure time, what next? Go on the HSE website. They have a very useful spreadsheet that you can use. And as long as you know the vibration level of the tool and the exposure time of the tool, you can work out the daily exposure, or the A8, as a result of using that particular tool. Now, my advice to you is to work in terms of vibration exposure points. It's a lot easier. If you want to find the explanation of the concept of exposure points, I won't explain that to you here. Just go on the HSE website and you'll find that all that information there. It's well explained, and it's also quite well explained in the vibration regulations. Another advantage of this spreadsheet is that if the operative is using tools successfully during the course of the day, as long as you know the vibration level of the tool and how long he's using each tool for, you can find the daily vibrational exposure of each of the tools that he uses. And then you can add up all the points and get an overall daily exposure as a result of the operative using many tools or multiple tools for the day. And this here where my mouse is, this is the all important information that we're going to use in the next few slides. Earlier, I was telling you about those two trigger levels in the vibration regulations. Here is one of them, and it's the exposure limit value, and it's equivalent to 400 exposure points. So once you've worked out your daily exposure in terms of vibration exposure points, you compare what you've got from that spreadsheet to 400 exposure points. And if you exceed 400 exposure points or are very close to 400 exposure points, and the spreadsheet will indicate that, you will have to reduce his daily exposure to below 400 exposure points. He's not allowed to continue working at this level, and that's a legal requirement. And here's the other trigger level I was telling you about, is the exposure action value, which is equivalent to 100 exposure points. So again, compare your exposure points that you evaluated from the spreadsheet, and if it exceeds 100 exposure points or is very close to 100 exposure points, again, the spreadsheet will indicate that. Then you have to look to eliminate the vibration exposure or reduce it to as low as reasonably practicable. Now, if you cannot reduce the vibration exposure to as low as reasonably practicable, you are required to provide health surveillance and also provide information, instruction, and training to the employees. And earlier, I told you about when you were carrying out the risk assessment, that you had to identify those employees who were particularly at risk. And I'll remind you, those employees may be ones who already have signs of HAVs, or may be particularly sensitive to vibration, or indeed may be working in cold and damp conditions. These employees are regarded as particularly at risk. And if that's the case, they should also be provided with health surveillance and information, instruction, and training, even if their exposures are below 100 exposure points. Now, I must make a mention about health surveillance. There's a couple of important points about that. Well, firstly, there may be a legal requirement for you to provide health surveillance. So other than that, if, for instance, you have implemented controls as a result of carrying out your risk assessments and you want to find out how effective they are, health surveillance should be able to tell you that, because if you carry out health surveillance and there are no issues after you have implemented controls, you must be doing something right. In other words, your control methods seem to be working. And secondly, if there are any employees in your organization who may have signs of injury, which they may not be aware of, or perhaps you may not be aware of, then health surveillance comes in quite useful, because health surveillance should be able to detect these employees, hopefully in time, so that you can manage them before their injuries get worse. The other benefit of health surveillance is baselining. In other words, pre-employment screening. If you've got new employees joining your organization, you would want to know their health status. And if they do have any health issues, at least you can manage them effectively through their employment with your business. Now, I would strongly recommend that you do carry out pre-employment screening, because sooner, perhaps later on down the line, you never know when you may need it in case of civil claims or HSE intervening. So it'll be a good idea. It's a very good idea, and I recommend it, that you carry out pre-employment screening and have a record of that. This is the most important slide deck of the slide of the whole slide deck. At least I think so anyway, because any business that's associated with hand-arm vibration, your primary objective should be to eliminate the risk of the vibration, or if you cannot do that, reduce it to as low as reasonably practicable. This is a legal requirement, and also it's a legal requirement, and my recommendation to you is that when you're carrying out this process, always make sure you document it, because once again, if you're faced with civil claims or HSE intervention, they will want to see evidence of this. So now that you've carried out your risk assessment, the next step to do is implement controls. Well, many of you are from what tuning in tonight are from a health and safety environment, so no doubt you've seen this inverted triangle, which is applicable in other areas of health and safety as well. When it comes to hand-arm vibration, the first thing you should look at is, can you actually eliminate the process? Which means no need to do the process, therefore you've eliminated the risks. Now, quite often, this is not the case. So then you should look at the next stage, which is substitution. In other words, can you separate the employee from the hazard? How would you go about doing that? Well, automation can do that for you, and mechanization. Here are some examples in various sectors of industry. But just be very careful that when you're taking the risk away, say you're taking the hand-arm vibration risk away, you don't introduce other risks that may make it more hazardous for him than what the hazard was in the first place. So look at the risk situation as a whole. There's other ways by which you can. Well, this is the next hierarchy of control, and this is engineering control. You could look for reduced vibration tools, but just be a bit careful that the last thing you want is to get a tool with very much reduced vibration, but you end up using the tool for a long period of time, because you bring back the risks that way. So think efficiency. You could go for harnesses and jigs. You can apply that as a control that reduces the chances of vibration, or reduces the vibration transmission into the body. And also consider ergonomics as a way of reducing carpal tunnel syndrome like injuries, or musculoskeletal type of injuries. In other words, use the right tool for the right job. Next in line is the administrative controls, things like job rotation, job sharing. This actually directly reduces the daily vibration exposure. However, it's not as effective as reducing the vibration or level of the tool. But if you've got no choice and there's no alternative, then task sharing is the way to actually reduce the risks. And if you've noticed that your employees are using their power tools where they have increased grip strength or increased feed forces, that actually is a risk, because under operating a tool under these conditions maximizes the transfer of vibration energy to the operator, and therefore puts him at risk. So if that's the case, you might look to provide him with training so that he can use the tool effectively and safely. You may also wish to implement a policy of tool maintenance and consumable replacement when worn, because with this sort of policy, it does tend to reduce the vibration of the tools that are poorly maintained, and consumables that also are in poor condition tend to give off high vibration and noise level as well. So look to implement a program of tool maintenance and the replacement of consumables in good time. There's other methods by which you can control the risks. You can argue that these may be administrative as well. For instance, consider implementing a purchase policy where you focus on buying low vibration tools, more efficient tools. It's a policy you could look to implement, and perhaps provide your employees, you should look to provide your employees with warm clothing and gloves. As I explained to you earlier, when the person is working in cold and damp conditions, it slows down the blood circulation, making them more vulnerable to HAVs. So look to provide them with warm clothing and gloves to maintain their blood circulation. And smoking, that's another way by which you can control the risks, or rather, the lack of smoking. Smoking introduces nicotine into the bloodstream, which slows down the blood circulation. And as I explained earlier, with a slowed blood circulation or reduced blood circulation, they're more vulnerable to have. So consider, or rather, try to discourage your employees from smoking, particularly when they're using power tools or in break periods between using power tools. Here's another myth buster, and that is anti-vibration gloves. If you're using anti-vibration gloves as a form of protection, my advice to you is that these things don't work. So don't rely on anti-vibration gloves for protection. Now you might say, but they sell them at my local tool station or my local B&Q. Well, they don't work. The thing is, as far as vibration is concerned, vibration is made up of from the tools are made up of low frequency components and high frequency components. The gloves will probably likely or are likely to cut out the high frequency components of vibration, which gives you the sensation that they do work. However, the high frequency components of vibration are not the dangerous vibrations. They are the harmful vibrations, rather, are the low frequency components, and they come right through the gloves. So anti-vibration gloves do not work from that point of view. So if I were you, I would disregard anti-vibration gloves. They are not an effective form of protection. According to insurers, any business that's associated with hand-down vibration, the biggest risk to them would be civil claims. Now, this is not surprising, bearing in mind that we have no win, no fee present everywhere. You can see it advertised, and this could be very tempting for employees just simply to pick up a phone or click a mouse button. After all, what do they have to lose? So consider this may be a risk to organizations. Civil claims could be a risk to organizations. And talking about civil claims, what happens if a business is unfortunate enough to lose a civil claim? What are the consequences? Well, firstly, it's more than likely that your insurance will pay out the civil claim fine. However, bear in mind that the HSC actually carried out some research, and they found out, or they investigated, that as a result of the investigation, they found out that for every £1 of civil claim that was paid out, it actually cost the organization anywhere between 8 to 36 times of that civil claim in terms of uninsured costs. Now, these uninsured costs, as you can see there, consist of things like increased insurance premiums, naturally, payment of insurance excess, replacement staff, court costs. So you can see that these uninsured costs mount. Now let's see what a typical claim could cost an organization in terms of uninsured costs. I have it on good authority from someone working in the insurance industry, where I asked him what a typical ballpark claim, hand-down vibration claim could cost. He said, well, if you go anywhere between 10 to 15K, then you wouldn't be far off the mark. So let's apply that 10 to 50, or rather, let's apply the information that the HSC provided to that range, 10 to 15K. And that would mean that the uninsured costs to an organization could be anywhere between 80K and over £500,000 for a typical HABS claim. So just think about that for a minute. As if that claim wasn't bad enough, there are other knock-on effects or consequences, mainly bad consequences to the organization. Firstly, reputational damage. There may be other organizations not wanting to do business with you. In other words, there could be potential customers not wanting to do business with the organization with this poor health and safety record. And then your employees may wish to up sticks and leave, again, because of your poor health and safety record. And for that reason, It may be difficult to recruit good employees. And the morale of your employees is bound to be decreased with your poor health and safety records, which is also going to affect your productivity. So all these three are bound to affect your bottom line, really. But above and beyond the money thing, really, it should be a moral responsibility for the employer to protect the employee, from ill health. So ask yourself these questions. Have you got all these things in place? And I'm just going to flash them up on the screen. And if your answers tend to be no, these are what the possible consequences could be to your organization. And if you have covered all these things in your organization, have you actually got evidence of this? Because if you haven't got evidence of this, or if it's not documented, then you won't have a leg to stand on when it comes to litigation and HSE intervention. So we've come to the end of the webinar, and these are some of the key messages that you should take away. HAVS is still an issue in the workplace. I showed you about that, and indeed it may be an underestimated injury or even an underreported injury, according to the HSE. You should be able to recognize these symptoms of HAVS and also identify the risks of HAVS in your workplace. And I've explained to you what how to go about carrying out a risk assessment in a competent manner, or what a competent risk assessment should consist of. What examples of risk controls could you implement so that you protect your employees and also comply with the regulations? And also, I've made it clear, I've also explained to you some of the myths to be debunked. And what could the likely consequences be to your organization for any health failures? And what you need to put into place so that, what processes and systems you need to put into place so that you best be able to defend against civil claims, and also discourage baseless claims, and also prevent HSE intervention. And I hope this webinar did what it said on the tin. And before we get to the question and answers session, if you've got any, there's just a couple of things. There's one thing I wanted to ask of you, is that if it's okay, I would like to get a feedback form on this webinar. So if it's okay for me to send you by your email this feedback form, and you can respond to it. Now, I know some of you, when you signed up to this webinar, you opted out of receiving marketing information. That's fine. But all I want to do is just send this feedback form. Feedback form that you can send back to me. I'd be pretty grateful for that. If there's any questions that you have, just please fire away. Yes, Mr. Kinderman, I think training is quite important because what it instills, it actually instills a culture of behavior, which sometimes I do find that is lacking. So training is important, even when I think it's not a legal requirement. Training is important, certainly from a culture point of view. And also, yes, it can be made interesting. I don't believe in training where what you do is you just put up some PowerPoint slides. I try to make it as interactive as possible with the operatives, and I find that we get a good two-way rapport when training does. When I provide them with that method of training, and at the end of the training, I can see that there seems to be some behavioral changes which does benefit them, and they start to understand the needs for changing their behavior so that they actually protect themselves, and it's a benefit to them, and also it'll be a benefit at the end of the day to their family as well. So thanks for that question. And I think if there's any more questions, do put the questions there. And otherwise, thank you very much again, and good night.